Good evening. My name is Alicia Barrett with Binny's, but tonight I am joined by Luisa Ponzi, winemaker for Ponzi Vineyards, who just celebrated their 50th anniversary in winemaking up in the Willamette Valley. And Luisa's been making wine with them for 27 years, now the second generation. And Luisa, we're thrilled to have you. Thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thank you. It's nice to be here, and thank you to Benny's for being such a strong supporter over the years, and we appreciate it.
So tonight we're going to talk about 3 different wines, 1 Pinot Gris, 2 Pinot Noirs from the Willamette, and Luisa's going to walk us through those. But first, to give you an idea on the Ponzi story, which is fabulous, one of the kind of early arrivals into the Willamette Valley, Luisa's going to walk us through a few slides here, which I'm going to bring up for you. Let me just go back a couple. Oh, sorry, one moment.
Great. Yeah, so I thought I'd give you a little history on Ponzi and where we are in the world. Very short, and we'll get right to the wines. There we go. So this is our winery facility in the Willamette Valley. This is our hospitality center, which I hope you can all come and visit us at some point. It's a beautiful place in the valley. My family started our winery in 1970, as it says there. There's some historical photos which are always fun to show. So we came up from California. My parents had a crazy dream of growing Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. They had fallen in love with the Burgundian wines and wanted to find a place that had what they felt was the perfect climate for these varietals. And they went up and down the West Coast and landed in the Willamette Valley, which they felt was ideal for these 2 varietals, a cooler climate where they could really shine. Found a little piece of land. This was in the late 60s. I was very young, the youngest of 3. And you'll see in my photos here, we were kind of a ragtag family and a little bit on the hippie side, you might say. And my parents really wanted to kind of get back to the land and do something with the family and involve everybody. My father was a mechanical engineer. He got a job at the local community college. My mother was busy raising us kids, my brother, sister, and I. And we started this adventure all together, as you can see here, everybody helping out to plant those first vines. At the time in the Willamette Valley, unbeknownst to us, there were 2 other families in the Willamette Valley at the time doing the exact same thing with the exact same varietals. That was the Erath family and another family called Corey, who is no longer around. And then Irie was also in the scene at that point. And so 3 wineries in this little valley. Fast forward today, we have over 800 wineries in the Willamette Valley. So it's been pretty tremendous growth in a very short amount of time, but always focused on these varietals of Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, and also Pinot Gris. You can go to the next slide. So the next generation, we came in later in the early 90s after kind of pursuing our own our own dreams, but realizing pretty quickly that once you're raised in that environment and really have worked together to build something, it's very hard to leave. It's really in your blood at that point. And so we all went off and tried different careers and realized, we always felt this tug to come home. My personal journey was towards medicine. I was always the kid that was kind of the one that tagged around with my father in the cellar. I loved being outside. I loved being, digging in the dirt and working in the vineyard. And I loved the manual labor that was involved with winemaking, kind of the messiness of it all. And my sister, who, she was much more the cheerleader at school and, much more of the kind of out there person that loved people and got a journalism degree and worked in Boston for quite some time. And then came back and took over our marketing and sales. So the 2 of us have worked together over almost the last 30 years, expanding the winery from our first little 10 acres to where we are today at about 150 acres of vines. We built a new winery, as you can see there on the hillside, a new hospitality center, really expanded the volume what we could do and where we could sell the wines across the country and even across the world at this point. So it's been our, pleasure to be able to work together on this, and especially in this month of National Women in Wine Month. I think today is the first National Women in Wine Day. So I'm happy to be here with you guys. We've always worked really hard to support women in this industry. But Marie and I work really well together. Neither of us wants the other one's job, so it works well. As I was saying, pursued medicine in my first life going through college, and at a certain point realized that wasn't going to work for me, and came back home to work with my father. That was 1991, and realized that really this mix of science and art that you can have with winemaking was really compelling to me. It was a bit of an epiphany for that vintage for me to understand that there was chemistry and science to art and not to winemaking, and not just tugging hoses and cleaning drains. And so I went off to Burgundy at that point and went to school there, got a degree in enology and viticulture, and came back in 1993 and took over the winemaking from my father. So for those of you who haven't been out to Oregon, I hope you can all come someday and visit us. But I thought I'd just give you a little snapshot of this is the state of Oregon. The Willamette Valley sits in the northwest corner. You can see Washington right above us there. It's a little valley about 100 miles long and about 50 miles wide. Lots of AVAs in there. We've established many AVAs over the last couple decades. My sister and I just recently accomplished getting the Laurelwood District AVA approved. That's where all of our vineyards are, and you can see it there right below Portland. So we are kind of the closest AVA outside of Portland at this point. I think your final slide is almost a little bit about the winemaking. Having grown up with my father, teaching me about winemaking, blended with kind of formal training in Burgundy, I approach my winemaking in this pretty traditional way. I've been trained, but I also know what works for us in our vineyards, since we've been working with the same vineyards for so long, that I really have, I think I approach my winemaking much more intuitively than anything else at this point. I rely on my palate mostly for most decisions, and have accumulated a really great team that works with me, mostly women, that I've come to rely on quite heavily to help me in all the decisions that we make with winemaking. So that's a little bit of a snapshot of our cellar, our winery, our processing, and so forth. I can go through the winemaking a little bit more as we taste the wines.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Luisa. And here are the wines that we have tonight that are on your shelves at your local binnies. So we do encourage, if you don't have them now, to go out and try them. But a few things that I want to talk about, and we'll get to the Pinot Gris in kind of in one quick second here, but you all can, hear from Luisa why, well, many reasons why we invited her to join Binnies and are grateful for her time. But as she said, as we close out kind of Women's History Month and we celebrate National Women in Wine, what, just a perfect winemaker to have, and all that you've accomplished, Luisa. So we'll get into all of that. I want to start when your family kind of first moved up to the Willamette Valley, so in the late 60s. What was it about the Willamette that caused your parents to make the move? And, we know the cool climate, and you referenced kind of their interest in Pinot Noir, but when they arrived, kind of what was that like? And did they kind of know right away they found the right place?
Okay, well, I was a year old. Let's just preface it by that. I wasn't, so I don't remember a lot of those early days, but I do know that, no, they didn't know if they had found the right place. They were going by, their visits to Burgundy and France, their reading. They were, academic people and read a lot. My father is first generation Italian. So I think he thought that he had like winemaking in his blood somehow, but he really had no idea what he was doing. So they were really out of their league. but felt that this was really something they wanted to pursue. And they did feel that the Willamette Valley was the right place. You know, they did look at the weather reports, the rainfall, the high and low temperatures. They educated themselves. And when they did their travels, they went all the way up to like the Okanagan Valley and looked at that, and then really came down and thought, this is really perfect. This little valley, a very fertile valley, beautiful hillsides, you know, and had the climate that they were looking for. So there was an educated guess. They did not pick an ideal piece of land to start with, honestly. They picked a piece of land that was easy to farm. So not a hillside piece, but much more of kind of a plateau. And really, my father tells stories of, you know, he bought an old tractor, but he really didn't know what to do with it. And he kind of watched his neighbors who were farming strawberries and they were out tilling. So he'd go out and till and, you know, really just trying to figure it out. The first 10 years, I think, was just complete experimentation. And luckily they found, you know, some other people in the valley that were crazy enough to do this. And when they found each other, then things really started to go, because then they could talk, they could, you know, share experiences. And that's really what this industry in Oregon has been based on, is this collaborative spirit of working together and learning together. And that's why we've moved so quickly, so fast, I think.
Yeah. Before we came on, Luisa and I were chatting about just how different the Willamette Valley is to a lot of wine regions, not all, but in that it's so centered on small wineries, family-owned wineries, and it really differentiates it from some of the kind of the larger, more famous places. And we need to remember that it was only I think it was in 1961 that the first vineyard of Vitis vinifera was planted in the Willamette. I mean, it was not long ago. And to see the growth on the global stage that the Willamette Valley has achieved is tremendous. And to your point of just the collaboration, the sentiment that if we all work together and promote this region and learn together how to make world-class wines, we'll be better for it. So love that about the region.
Yeah, and that's been maintained. I think there's been a culture that's been established here, and that's how we work. And so it's been very successful.
So let's get into the Pinot Gris, if you don't mind. We are tasting the 2019 Ponzi Vineyards Pinot Gris from the Willamette Valley. And tell us your thoughts on Pinot Gris. So it's the second most planted variety, I think, in the Willamette, but I've kind of read that it's slowly starting to lose some of that place to Chardonnay. So what are your thoughts on Pinot Gris and your approach to the wine?
Right. I mean, you heard me say that the goal of my parents was to grow Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, right? That was their goal when they first started. And the Pinot, they got a great start. The wines were pretty good from the beginning. The Chardonnay did not do so well, and it turned out to be a bad choice of plant material, really, which made Chardonnay kind of the ugly stepsister for a long time. Where Pinot Gris, which was one that, you know, my parents also planted quite a bit of Alsatian varietals just to kind of hedge their bets that maybe it was a little cooler than they thought. And maybe there would be some other varietals that would work. Pinot Gris was one of those kind of experimental varietals that they put in. And Pinot Gris really took off. I mean, it was, it just expressed itself so well in our climate. Nobody had really had Pinot Gris domestically in the US until Oregon started to produce it. You know, our first production of Pinot Gris was in 1978. And that was really the first commercial production of Pinot Gris in the country. Very small production, but you know, that was the first thing we did. And it just, you know, people loved it, and it's easy to love. Pinot Gris is such a varietal that has so much going for it. Aromatically, flavor, it's very, you know, approachable, goes with a lot of different foods. So it's one of those varietals that really was not hard to really turn people onto pretty quickly. And once we found that success, it began to be planted. Yes, as you said, it overtook any Chardonnay plantings for a very long time. Now that is being reversed at this point. There are people that are solely producing Chardonnay and Pinot. Pinot Gris is being pulled out in a lot of cases to plant Chardonnay at this point, which I find a little bit sad. The Pinot Gris is just a lovely expression of this varietal in the Willamette Valley. And you can see it in this wine. This is a great example of Oregon Pinot Gris. You've just got all these beautiful, aromatics of like melon and honeysuckle, and white peach is always something that I pick up in these wines. Beautiful acidity, which is kind of the trademark of the Willamette Valley. Little pepper, little meringue. It's a beautiful expression of what we can do here. My Pinot Gris tend to be, I do all stainless steel fermentation, so I'm not looking for a lot of mid-palate weight. I really want these wines to be fresh and lively. These should be beautiful spring, summer wines. And I often leave a little bit of CO2 in the wine, so there's almost this little frizzante on the mouth as well.
As we are looking ahead to the Easter holiday, I cannot recommend this wine enough, but as Luisa says, just is so versatile, and we love selling this at Binny's because it is very food friendly. But as you mentioned, because of the stainless steel fermentation, because some will do some kind of large barrel maturation with Pinot Gris, or a little bit of fermentation in that, but with the clean kind of stainless steel approach that you're taking, it kind of it makes it so easy drinking kind of without food too. And there's so much fruit. The fruit's really fleshy, lots of layers, nice kind of round body, but yeah, not too weighty at all.
Yeah, I mean, 19 was a beautiful vintage too for us. Just as to go back to the vintage, it was just a lovely kind of throwback to some of the more classic vintages in Oregon. We're getting warmer and warmer years here with
Sure.
the changing climate, and so to see a vintage like 19 come around where we had some really nice, cool nights and nice cool fall to pick everything just beautifully fresh and lively acidity.
Before we leave the Pinot Gris, you mentioned some people ripping it up in favor of Chardonnay. How much of that is demand driven versus climate driven?
Oh, actually, I think it's more passion driven, to be honest.
Oh, okay.
I think that people here are so excited about Oregon Chardonnay, which is, again, if you can get your hands on some Oregon Chardonnay, they are just lovely, and they're so different than the domestic, kind of California Chardonnays that we're used to. These wines are, they have the minerality, they have the brightness, they have the silkiness. They're just gorgeous wines. So I think it's being driven by passion at this point, because they're very small production still, and they're just barely getting out into the world where people are understanding what's happening with them. So I think it's more what we want to do, and it kind of goes back to the whole Oregon culture of people here are here because they want to make great wine, and Chardonnay seems to us to be the next step for us.
Yeah, well, best answer.
Yeah.
No one can argue with a passion-driven,
I know, it's probably not the best business plan, but yeah.
So as we finish the Pinot Gris and go to the Tavola Pinot Noir, I loved the photos that you showed in the beginning of you as a young child with your parents. And I also mentioned to Luisa, I'm reading a book that her sister wrote called Pinot Girls. If you want to know everything about the Ponzi family, I recommend it. So I feel like I know a little bit about your childhood in reading this. But I want to kind of, paint that picture a little bit more, because your parents, you said, were kind of learning on the job, trying to figure this whole viticulture thing out. And can you share a little bit of how did their ambition and resourcefulness shape you as a woman in the wine industry, and kind of how did they inspire you to do what you do today?
Wow, so many ways. First off, my mother is a remarkable woman, and she, as in all stories, there's always this man that's in the front and then the woman's in the back, and she was truly the heart and soul of what we were doing and really kept it all together. And my father would go off to work because somebody had to go off to work. The wine was not going to make money. And so in those early days, he would go off to work all day, and she'd go out and take care of the vineyard. And she was the sole person for that vineyard. She pruned, she leaf pulled. She did everything in that vineyard. I mean, I remember walking to the school bus and there was my mom in the vineyard. See you, Mom. I'll see you when I get home, you know. And she was tending a huge garden and she was taking care of all of us, you know, all those things that have to be done and in such a lovely way. No resentment. It was all joy. And then when we did have wine, it was her job to sell the wine, right? So she was our first sales force and she would go out there bravely and say, here we have some Oregon wine. And you know, the very few restaurants that were in Portland would say, what are you talking about? What's Oregon wine? There is no such thing. So, you know, very brave to take on all of that and try to educate the world on what we were trying to do. And then when we started our tasting room, you know, again, she was at the forefront of that. So there's been a very strong role model from my mother, of course, just hard work and really stick-to-itness and, you know, courageous and all those things you have to be a woman in this industry. You just have to go out and do it. And then again, you know, they were both so supportive of what we wanted to do. There was never any obligation to come back and work at the family business. And I think that impacted us in very strongly in that we had a choice, that we could make our own choices to do that. Yeah, I think my decision to go off to Burgundy was probably in a large part watching my mother and how she went about her life. That was a big decision to go off to Burgundy and learn with all the men in that program and in that culture and in those wineries that I was very much not allowed to do certain things because of my gender. So it was, you know, all those things have, you know, you kind of just accumulate this this bit of a shield of how you go through the world and just determination to keep going.
Yeah. And a question here from the audience. And by the way, for those watching, I'm sorry I forgot to mention this, but please put your questions in the Q&A function on Zoom. We'd love to hear from you. A couple that have come in, one particularly relevant right now, Luisa, where did you train in Burgundy? And maybe we can use that to also transition to your kind of philosophy and winemaking approach on Pinot Noir.
Sure. Yeah. So when I decided at, you know, in '91, I worked with my father and just kind of had this, you know, epiphany that this is something I might want to do. I had the choice to go to school, and where did I want to go? I could go to Davis, which was the obvious choice. That is, you know, it was the enology school at that time. But I felt that really I needed to go someplace that was focusing on these varietals that we were trying to produce. And Burgundy seemed like the logical step, although I didn't. I had high school French, and I and needed to go to school in France and in French. So I went and I took some intensive courses in Strasbourg and Dijon and in just the language, and then I worked a harvest with Christophe Roumier and Maurice Saint-Denis. Just an amazing producer. Just dream to be able to work with him and learn from him. His family was extremely generous to me and put me up and helped me through the year. I went to school in a very small school in Beaune, which is really a school where the next generation of the domains go. So these were all the children that were going to take over from their families, the next generation. And that alone was a very interesting experience, just to hear the stories and their perspective of whether they were being forced, whether they had a choice, whether they were going to change things or keep it the same, or, so that whole thing was enlightening, and the ability to taste wine. So a lot of those sons and daughters and my classmates were, they're now very famous winemakers in Burgundy, and to have access to those wines and train my palate really informed me of how I wanted to approach my winemaking. So it wasn't really about the technical part of going to school. It was more about being in that environment, just being able to absorb the wines that were there, and that really gave me my passion for how I wanted to make wine.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, no better place to start than Burgundy.
Yeah.
And to build on what they've done, and also, but in a different place. It's
in a different place, right, right.
A lot of people make that Willamette Burgundy connection because of the Burgundian kind of style that the Willamette Valley has, and most Willamette Valley winemakers I talk to always, like to reinforce though that they're not Burgundy. It's, just because it doesn't taste exactly like Burgundy, it's not going to. It's from a different place and different hands, different microclimates and so forth. So let's get into the Tavola Pinot Noir, if you don't mind, the 2018. Tell us a little bit about this wine.
So the 18 vintage as a whole was really one of the most magical vintages in Oregon. It was one of those that everything just came together. And we have such variability in Oregon. The climate is wonderful, but at the same time, it's unpredictable. And so, we never quite know what kind of a year we're going to get until we're actually in harvest. And 18 was just one of those years that everything really lined up from the beginning to end, from spring during the bud break and all the way through the summer. We had quite moderate temperatures. There wasn't a lot of heat, but it wasn't also, we didn't get a lot of rain. And so it was kind of one of those vintages where as a winemaker, you feel like it's being handed to you on a platter, and your job is just don't screw it up, So, and Tavola in particular is a wine that, the style of the wine is one that we really want people to have as an introduction to Oregon Pinot. So it's something that should be very pure Oregon Pinot, meaning that it shows the acidity, the fresh fruit that you can get here, the structure that we have in the wines, the tannin structure, but not too complicated. This should be a wine that, I think of it almost like a pizza wine. Like, this is a wine that you can drink with almost anything. It's approachable. It's got tons of spice and beautiful kind of black fruited spice and raspberry and, pepper, black pepper and cola. There's just a lot going on, but it's not a wine that you feel like you have to sit down and contemplate. It should be just enjoyable. Nice soft tannins, bright fruit, but still has the trademark beautiful acidity and structure. So,
Luisa, do you remember, or probably don't remember firsthand, but maybe you were told, but do you know what clones of Pinot Noir and Chardonnay your parents started with? This is a question in as well from a viewer, and they said that they assume your Chardonnay now is Dijon clones, but
yeah, so I kind of touched on the fact that we started off with Chardonnay, a clone that was quite inappropriate for our climate. So, at the time there wasn't a lot of options. You couldn't go to a million different nurseries and find the exact things that you wanted. It was pretty much calling Davis and saying, we want some Pinot and Chardonnay. and they would send you, what they had.
Yeah.
And the Chardonnay was a clone called 108, which some people refer to as the Dolly Parton clone. It's kind of this massive, it just sets these beautiful, massive clusters, but never got ripe in our climate because it just needed a lot more heat. And so we kind of got on the back foot on Chardonnay until we got the Dijon clones in the late 80s, early 90s. And those just changed the game for Chardonnay. But now with our climate warming up, a lot of people are going back to these older clones. The 108 is looking quite nice these days. So, the clonal selection is so important. And as we learn more about this region and our hillsides and our soils, we're really being much more specific about the clones and the rootstocks that we're planting in different areas. The Pinot Noir clone that my parents started with, luckily, was the one called Pomard. And it was pretty perfectly suited. It's still widely planted in the Willamette Valley today. So They were lucky with that one.
So I love the Tavola, and as you mentioned, it's everything that a Pinot Noir drinker will enjoy, from those crunchy dark red fruits and pomegranates and little cola, starting to get kind of an earthy element to it. But so fun and you don't need to contemplate and think too much. It's very easy to enjoy. So let's then go to perhaps something that does need a little more thought, and the Classico from 2016 is what's on our shelves at the moment. And immediately when I smelled this one, it was just so much more savory, so much more earthy than the previous, and it's quite exciting. So I'll let you know the difference.
This one is so the Classico we consider kind of our classic, style. This comes from mostly our estate vineyards, but definitely vineyards that are in our AVA, the Laurelwood District AVA, very specific soil called Laurelwood, which produces wines that, like you said, are just really have this strong savory note. They're kind of these Mediterranean herbs of lavender and sage and all those things, with hints of kind of sometimes hints of like black licorice and black tea, those kinds of things, a little bit rustic tannins, a little earthy dustiness to them. Very specific wines that come from this soil. And so the Classico is sourced from quite a few vineyards, but mostly from this one AVA here. And the goal here is to produce a wine, yes, that is very attractive and gives you those big aromatics and nice full flavor, but also does have some richness and depth to the wine. So there's longer barrel age, a little more differentiation in the winemaking, meaning that I might do kind of longer fermentations, a little bit cooler fermentations, trying to build the tannin structure in this wine just a little bit more. So it gives it some ageability, as well as some length and kind of more structure to the wine from the beginning. But it's just a lovely example of kind of it's a snapshot, in my mind, a snapshot of the vintage itself. It should reflect what happened that year. 16, as in this particular wine, you get all those savory notes, lots of richness in this wine, kind of roasted coffee even in this one. But this is a 16 vintage, and to me, this is a very 2016 wine. It's got all that ripeness that we had from a warmer year in 16, which was a extremely warm year for Oregon. Strangely enough, it wasn't necessarily higher daytime temperatures, but it was higher nighttime temperatures. And so we lost some of that ability to hold the acidity. And so you're going to get this richness and this roundness and ripeness from that vintage. Just a really beautiful wine with the ability to go somewhere to age and to continue to evolve.
Yeah, it's absolutely beautiful.
Yeah.
For those that are not having it tonight, please go out and treat yourself. Question that's come in, a lot of Pinot Noir producers have been kind of experimenting or increasing percentages of whole cluster fermentation. What's your approach to whole cluster? Do you like it? Do you not like it? Have you played around with that?
Yeah, the whole cluster, I have, again, kind of going back to my training in Burgundy, I have a deep respect for people who can do whole cluster really well. It's a hard technique, I think, to learn and to master, and you have to have the right sites, the right fruit, the right vintage. And so, yes, I definitely have been playing around with whole cluster more and more with our older vines. So we have vines that are, 50 years old now, 45, 50 years old, which I find are very well suited. They ripen quite slowly and late. And so by the time the fruit comes in the door at harvest, you have these clusters with very lignified, meaning very dark stems. They've been seasoned almost. So you don't get these bright green, bitter stems. You get kind of dark woody stems, which I find are much more appropriate for whole cluster. And so I've been experimenting, yes, a lot more and trying to understand the interaction, the ageability, how these wines change in the barrel. They become very soft and silky and beautiful. So it's definitely something that I'm incorporating. It's usually at our higher level reserve wines and single vineyard wines that I'm using this technique. But I think it's a wonderful, and then that aspect of the kind of savory notes that you get with whole cluster. It's just a beautiful technique, I think, if you can do it right. So I would say that, yes, I think like a lot of people in the Valley, I'm definitely pursuing it and learning about it, but I haven't mastered it.
Well, very modest, I'm sure. Now, I know we could probably have an entire hour discussion on the formation of the Laurelwood district. But if you were to give us the cliff notes here, for those that are unfamiliar, getting an AVA approved is, no small task. And so firstly, congratulations on doing that. But just want to give us an overview for those unfamiliar with Laurelwood, kind of what did you put in there that defines this AVA, what sets it apart? Are we going to see that on your labels in future? Tell us the Laurelwood story, if you will.
Yeah, happily. So this area that we're in, which is kind of the southeast slope of the Chehalem Mountains, and the Chehalem AVA is already an established AVA, but we're on this one slope facing towards Portland, the east slope of the Chehalem Mountains, and all of our vineyards are planted there. And it's an AVA that we started the application 10 years ago, actually, and you're right, it's a huge process. And it was especially difficult because we wanted this AVA to be based on a soil. It's the first AVA in the Willamette Valley to actually be defined by soil. All the other AVAs are defined geographically. Mostly they're all geographic designations. There's the Van Duzer that's defined by their wind, but this is the first to be defined by soil. And so when you find a wine, and you will, they're starting to come out now with the Laurelwood AVA, it's called the Laurelwood District AVA. When you find that designation on a wine, you can know that it comes from Laurelwood soil. And that soil is very distinct in the valley. This is the only area where it's at. And it's this kind of blend of sedimentary soil and the volcanic Jory soil that is all over the Willamette Valley. But we have this kind of old sedimentary topsoil that until you get down to the Jory soil, the basalt. And the wines are defined by their really, I mean, you just tasted them. I mean, these really spicy character to the aromatics, the savoriness, the rusticity of the tannins, very, very pronounced structure to these wines that you have to be careful of in the winemaking, as it can go a little too far if you're not careful. But the ageability of these wines is extreme. I mean, our wines have been able to age for 30, 40 years just beautifully. And I think a lot of it has to do with this specific soil type that we're working with. So it's really exciting. And yes, we have just released our Laurelwood Chardonnay and our Laurelwood Pinot Noir that'll be out for the 17 vintage. So these are yeah, very exciting for us to finally see wineries using this designation and people hopefully starting to understand a little bit more about the intricacies of the valley and how different soils can really affect the wines.
Thank you for that. Very well done. That was, all of 2.5 minutes. Very impressive. Thank you. So I also, as we close, I wanted to, as we kind of come back full circle as a woman in wine, any lessons, you shared a little bit about the inspiration, especially of your mom, but any other kind of lessons, any challenges, maybe you can kind of pick any of these questions that you've faced. You want to share any advice for the women watching, whether they're in wine or in whatever industry. What have you learned over the years?
Yeah, I mean, I think that when people ask me that question, it's, I think it's not just wine industry, it's just generally women, in the workplace that, but I do think that winemaking is a really great option for women. I think that women have a unique ability to make amazing wines. I honestly do. And I know, many of wonderful male winemakers, but I do think that the women that I've met that are making wine are, like myself, much more intuitive about the winemaking. We have the ability to kind of allow the wines to speak for themselves, not feel the need to often to jump in and manipulate. I think are more thoughtful in how we go about winemaking. So I think that it's really perfectly suited for women. And I've over the years found myself hiring more and more women in the cellar because I do appreciate their thoughtfulness and the way they approach the decisions of winemaking and their palates. And I feel like the more women we can get into this industry, the better. I would say, however, that education is really important. I think as a woman, almost in any field, you have to be overeducated to be respected, and to, you know, kind of hold your place from pretty quickly on instead of having to earn your place. And then experience and taking the time to really work in different places, learn from different women, try to pick wineries where there's a mentor that you can work with, and ask tons of questions, and just, you know, do all the things that you need to do to just feel really confident in your craft, because once you feel confident, then you'll excel. So I think there's no real distinction between winemaking and any other career for women. You have to work hard, you have to put yourself out there, and you have to really know your stuff.
Well, Luisa, thank you so much for
Yes.
those words, and for the wonderful wines, and for just the excellent winery that your family has established now 50 years on. Thank you for sharing them. Really appreciate it. Yeah, I know you got a wine club to run too. Lots going on Zoom tonight, but appreciate your time. And for those watching, I'm going to put up a slide here at the end showing the wines that we tasted. But Luisa, cheers. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all for attending and listening. Appreciate it.